Growing up, I always used to talk about health and wellness to everyone around me. Some people would take my advice, some people would avoid it, and some would ignore it, saying that, hey man, I've got bad genes or this runs in my family. The area of genetics or this information on how complex genes work at that time was still limited to people maybe in Harvard, Stanford, MIT, or probably in the secret grounds of Russia or China. And unfortunately, I could never help that set of people because, to be honest, genes was an alien language to me itself. Then fast forward so many years to this date, the world knows so much about genetics and genes. But the long question, there's still like this old question still arises. Do genes dictate our destiny? I can surely give you my take on it. But to take this to another level, I have invited a special guest on the podcast today. My guest on the show today has taken, trust me, she's taken a deep dive in health. How deep, you might ask? Well, she's got a degree in microbiology, anatomy, health and wellness from Texas and Parker University. She also has a doctorate of chiropractor and has written a book on genetics. Everyone, welcome Dr. Christy Sutton. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. Thanks. That was a great, eloquent introduction.
Well, I'm sure I could be saying more because you've done so many things. But tell me something. You've got expertise in so many fields. Why did you decide to go after genetics and even write a book on genetics?
Oh, that's a good question. So it was just another piece in becoming a better clinician, basically, and trying to really bridge the gap that I saw was present in with my patients wanting to know about these things. And as basically there was a lot of information about genetics before the direct to consumer genetic tests like 23andMe came to market, but there wasn't a lot of testing of genetics. So I would talk to people about a genetic risk, but I didn't actually have the readily available and for many people affordable way to just test for a large number of genes. And as that became available with 23andMe, at least at that point in time, this was about 10 years ago, then I realized, okay, this is just another clinical tool that we need to implement so that it's not just me talking about a theoretical risk, but I'm actually able to say, you do have this gene, this is what this means, this is what we can do about it. And it just created a much more solid clinical and just patient approach. It created a better treatment plan for the patient. And it took as much, if the more questions and variables you can take out of a patient's clinical situation, the better long-term approach you get. So there was that piece. And then I believe that if you really want to help somebody with something, you have to really know as much as you can about it. And so there was not a lot of good information about a lot of these genes at the time that I wrote the book. And so people were wanting to know about these things. And I just didn't feel like there were a lot of trustworthy, well-researched sources. And I just felt like there was a lot of like marketing and confusion and questionable recommendations. So I wrote this book about a ton of different genes, and I tried to, keep it well researched while still clinically relevant and easy to understand. And I also realized in the process that of not just writing the book, but also really looking at people's genetic reports, which primarily I personally use 23andMe, and then I download that data and I upload it to my website, Genetic Detoxification, which gives me additional information and a genetic report that goes along with my book. So those are the primary things I'm looking at. Just because, and I'm not saying 23andMe is the best. I think there's probably some, good and better products coming on the market. It's just so readily available and so many people have done it that it's a valuable tool to know and use. And so as I wrote the book and then I started looking at people's reports, it became very clear that certain genes were really sticking out to be relevant, not just, genetically, there's a lot of research behind them, but they were actually creating lab things that were showing up and, symptoms and diseases. And so now I've kind of been able to more quickly address the things that I think are the biggest priority. And eventually maybe I'll write another book just on those, and because I've continued to study and teach and even in some cases write about those. So it's
Amazing.
just, yeah, there's a lot to it. So
Yeah, I like some of the things that you brought up there. First thing is that the more data you have about someone, like as a clinician or, as a doctor, or just the more data you have, you can look at the problem in a more optimized way. And then there's always this problem that, okay, I've got a lot of data now. I use, and for those of you listening who don't know, 23andMe is like a genetic analysis tool and website that you can log on to, and you can order your samples, and then they upload the data on their website. And what really gets to me here is that if you're if you don't understand science, and if you're not really passionate about health, and if you're not one of those people who can read long reports, then sometimes having a lot of data might even confuse you. And then to that, you've made a solution where you can take all that data, take all that confusion, because again, we have a compliance issue, right? People know what's good for them, but then they just don't want to do it because, you know, there's too much information out there, like you mentioned. But what I like about your approach is, you're taking the raw data, which people have tested for, and then you're running it through your own website and your own knowledge, and you're combining what is there in research papers, theories, and anecdotal evidence to comprise something which is more holistic, which goes beyond the thing of, okay, go for a 20-minute walk and, eat your vegetables, because we know, like, there's more to it. A person can be walking you know 20 minutes or running for 20 minutes and be eating all the vegetables and trying to sleep all right. But then if there is some biological thing to it, then that person's always tired, lethargic, cannot sleep well, cannot eat well. And so it's more complex. And I like the approach that you've taken, like taking raw data and converting it into manageable results. But then for the people who don't really understand this whole genetic thing, right now, we often hear the word, I mean, genes are sort of a newbie in the whole health industry. They've been there for a while, but people are more accustomed to DNA, or the word DNA. And most people would say, hey, I know some things about DNA, but a lot of people don't understand the whole science of genetics. So how would you explain in simple words like genes or genetics to a person who's trying to wrap their head around it? Sorry.
yeah, so let me see. I want to make this easy to understand. So, when you build a house, you kind of have like a blueprint on, or a building, you have kind of like a design for what that house is going to be like. And then the design of the house will depend on ultimately your input. The weather and building the house will affect it in some cases, the materials you use, the intricacies of the plumbing, all of that comes into ultimately building the house. So like our genes are kind of the blueprint for us. And then it's our environment that ultimately determines how those genes are expressed, meaning like how our house is built. So the genetics are important, and we can't deny that. But like you said, DNA is not our destiny. Having said that, it most certainly is a powerful part of who we are. And it's kind of our nature. So if you've heard the term nature versus nurture, the DNA is very much kind of like the nature of just biologically who you are at the most fundamental core. Having said that, your nurture, which is kind of how you are nurtured as you grow up, your environment, ultimately will determine how those genes are expressed. Meaning that I can have the exact same gene that can be expressed as something very bad or potentially something good in some cases, depending on my environment. So DNA is not our destiny, and I think that's a dangerous path to go down if you start looking at DNA and you don't have, the tools and the guidance to help you kind of know where to focus and what actionable things you can do about it. That can become kind of overwhelming and destructive. But if you do have the tools to help you kind of understand and guide you as far as what actionable steps you can take to basically identify your genetic Achilles heel and then protect yourself from it, because let's face it, most of us do have genetic Achilles heels, and it becomes much easier to protect ourselves from them if we can really laser in and focus on that one thing or two things rather than just kind of, okay, I have to do all of this to be healthy, which the more you do, the better. It's just sometimes it's nice to be able to kind of focus a little bit more on the top priorities.
I love your explanation. I love your explanation and your segue into that genes don't determine our destiny. But then there is this whole concept of, expressing those genes or flipping those switches on and off via means of epigenetics. And this is another area of study that has been, I mean, it's been popping out everywhere on how basically in for anyone who's listening, your genes might determine everything, right? You might be on high risk of cholesterol or something else, but then it is your lifestyle, it's your environment, it's the inputs that you go through, which we call epigenetics, which actually determine if you think of your genes as like a switch in the house, right? A light switch. Whether you're switching that switch on or off. Am I sort of going in the right direction, Dr. Christie?
As far as switching things on and off, absolutely. You can certainly switch things on and off depending on your environment, and you can certainly, trigger bad genes to be turned on and create diseases and symptoms. But you can also monitor your environment through labs, just generally, paying attention to what you're doing as far as your general health to really keep those bad genes off as much as possible. And some of us have, more of a challenge to keep those bad genes off. That's just how it is. It's the life isn't fair. Some people have lost the genetic lottery, and they have to be much more diligent about their environment and their epigenetics.
Mhm.
So,
I like that explanation. It's also like you know we always think of like a one solution that fits all, and most of the people will have that type of like an approach. Whether you see an Instagram celebrity or you see like Hollywood star, and they would just say, "Oh, perfect! This is someone that I want to look like or feel like," and then I'm just going to go ahead and do everything that this person does. But then 90% of the time people fail because they don't acknowledge the most essential thing of life, which is biochemical individuality, that all of us are made different. We have all, and then this ties into the genes as well. Some people's genes are favorable towards some outcomes. Some people's muscle fibers are favorable towards some outcomes. So there's all these nuances that are different. And to your point, if if someone who's listening and you want to go out and do all the things and you think that doing everything is going to help, yeah, it might help. But then if you want to like target, like super focus on yourself or your family or your kids and see what might be one of those things that you're missing, or what might be some of the things that are you have more of, and bring it to balance, that would be a better approach than to just following someone's advice on on how their body works rather than how your body works. Because again, we're all different. She spoke about the genetic lottery. Some people win it, some people just cruise through it. But again, it's your understanding and the knowledge and the protocol that gives you the power to take over. Now, Dr. Christie, when I think about like genes, right? So some things stand out. First thing that stands out is that most of the literature that's out there will tell you that the human body has around 37 trillion cells, right? And then in these cells we have our DNA. Some people would argue we have more cells. And you look at the human cells. Then within those cells, you have the mitochondria, which, if people have been following the podcast, you guys would know that these are mostly the power plants of our cells. And these are the ones that give us more energy, or energy in all. And the mitochondria have their own DNA, which is different from the human DNA. And then we're looking at, the other big population that comprises of us, even outnumbering the human cells, 100 trillion. That is the gut microbiome. And then the gut microbiome also have their own, they're different from us, they have their own genotype. So how does a person, when you're looking at like recommendations, how does a person navigate through like the human genome and then the mitochondrial genome and the bacterial genome? So this could be like confusing for some people. So what's your take on it? Like, how does someone navigate through this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, the human genome is the genes that we have inherited from our mom and dad, and that's, within our nucleus of our cell, and that's kind of like our blueprint for us. Having said that, the mitochondria, it has its own DNA and its own genome, and we inherit our mitochondria from our mothers. So that's a maternal inheritance. The father's mitochondria do not get passed down. That just comes from your maternal side. And that actually, the mitochondria, I don't know, I won't bore you with too much of the history of the mitochondria, but as you might already know, the mitochondria are an evolutionary symbiotic relationship between the human cell and an ancient bacterial cell. So basically, it's this symbiotic relationship where the human cell gives the mitochondria, which is this ancient bacteria that has now become a part of our body, but is a separate DNA. So the human cell, helps the mitochondria survive, and then the mitochondria helps the human cell survive, which then allows us to grow and thrive. Now, the gut microbiome, each bacteria or virus or parasite, which all of those things create our gut microbiome, each of those has its own individual DNA that is not hasn't become a part of the human cell like the mitochondria, but is very much separate as an individual or in a separate species. And so each of those, which there are a ton of them, not just in diversity, although most people don't have enough diversity within their microbiome, but with just sheer number. I would be making up this statistic if I was to say off the top of my head right now what the actual number of bacteria is in your gut, but it's more than the number of cells in your body. And one of the potential, biggest epigenetic switches, like you were talking about, if you want to keep those good genes on and keep bad genes from turning off, the gut microbiome is one of the most powerful tools for doing that. And unfortunately, we live in a day and age where antibiotics, or at least in America, being overused, overprescribed. People's gut microbiome is not as healthy as it should be. Not to say antibiotics haven't helped a lot of people, but they have caused a lot of damage to our gut microbiome. And that's why so I'm really into using really precision nutrition to prevent and help correct problems. And for example, with the gut microbiome, and I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, so I'm sorry. If somebody's taking an antibiotic, the only probiotic they can take while they're on that antibiotic is Saccharomyces boulardii, which is actually a good yeast, and it's not killed by antibiotics because it's a good yeast. But what it does is it actually kind of protects your digestive system from the bad stuff being able to kind of set up shop and grow back at an extremely high rate post antibiotics. So taking Saccharomyces boulardii during an antibiotic will protect you from having like a bad C. diff, which creates really bad diarrhea and digestive problems. You're less likely to get a C. diff infection, which is a bad bacteria that everybody has. You just have to keep it all within range and under control. So if you want to protect somebody from like as many bad side effects from antibiotics, they must take that Saccharomyces boulardii while they're on the antibiotic. And then after taking the antibiotic, they've got to load up on really high doses of strong, high quality probiotics. And I'm not just talking about like getting the yogurt that is at the grocery store, which I'm sure in Dubai the yogurt is much better than it is here, but here it's largely like sugar. And so there's some good ones, and like those are good and I like them. But I think ultimately, if you're not giving somebody a good probiotic after an antibiotic, you're doing them a lot of harm that you may not really truly understand because it may not manifest for years.
Mhm.
So.
And the amount of fights, not fights, but arguments that I've had with doctors over the years saying that, hey, you need this antibiotic. And I'm like, no, I don't. There must be some other way. Like, okay, yes, some serious cases you might need, or people around the world might need antibiotics, but I have tried my best to avoid antibiotics, after injuries, I mean, God knows what. There were only few things, after some root canal treatments, and there are some other things that I had to take antibiotics. But like Chrissy said, I was sure that right after taking the antibiotics, I go on a very, very powerful probiotic fiber, prebiotic fiber, the whole lots, trying to attack, or not attack, but like helping the good gut bacteria restore balance and flourish. Because once you take antibiotics, and a lot of people in this part of the world would just pop antibiotics even if they feel like a cold, like, they start sneezing and they pop in antibiotics because they know that the
Mhm.
doctor gave them something like this last time. And it's so nice that you brought this up, and anyone who's listening, please be careful. There are other ways, and it's you don't have to throw a bomb in your gut that will kill all of your good bacteria. Now,
Yeah, go
moving
ahead.
on. So now we know about, you've told us about genes and DNA, and now we know that there are different, DNAs. So talk to us about one of the most either underlooked or overlooked topic. Talk to us about protein, and what does protein do, or amino acid, what do they do in favor of like the genes?
Well, you need protein, which amino acids are like the building blocks of protein. You need amino acids, a complete protein, all of the essential and non-essential amino acids. But your body makes some amino acids, and those are the non-essential ones.
Mhm.
Now, the essential ones are the ones that your body doesn't make and you have to get from your diet.
Mhm.
And so you need like these building blocks, just like, you need bricks to build a house. The protein is what your body uses to make enzymes, to give integrity to cells, to really do the work that we need, whether it's building a muscle or making sure that your immune system's able to function properly. Protein is really kind of the building blocks for it. And so that's basically that's the role of protein in our body. Now, some people metabolize proteins maybe a little bit differently. Some people need more protein than others, but
Like vegans? I'm just joking.
vegans need a lot more protein than they are getting. I as a clinician, and I say everything, with the clinical window and kind of
Yeah.
perspective. As a clinician, I have never seen a healthy vegan. And if they are healthy, then they haven't been vegan for very long. They would, and I'm going to get some angry comments here, and I'll
No,
just say
always
that it won't be
happens.
the first and it won't be the last. But basically, most people that feel really good as a vegan, they have a dairy allergy. And the reason that they feel so noticeably better when they become vegan is because they get off of dairy. Um, and that's kind of the immediate improvement. And then what inevitably happens is they end up getting deficient in amino acids and nutrients, and their health deteriorates. And so if they're really, really careful and aware, then they might supplement with a lot of the amino acids and vitamins and nutrients that they're not getting. But it's just really hard and virtually impossible to supplement your way out of a
Mhm.
really deficient diet.
Yeah,
You
this
might be
is.
able to do it for a while, but eventually it'll catch up to you.
I mean, I did it for 3 years, and I was one of those vegans. Like, hey, do you know how much protein plants have? This was years and years ago, and then I
Mhm.
fell into the vegan trap, and then came out of it. I realized it wasn't the best, and yeah, since then I've just been giving people a word of caution because, again, we can advise people on our take or what the research says or what the science says or what you've been seeing in your clinic, but at the end it's their choice, and then it's just making them aware that yeah, okay, some vegans would say, oh yeah, I can supplement with vitamin B12, but there's just not that. There's carnosine, carnitine, there's creatine, there's so many complex things that truly for a long term it might be a bit difficult. And then also there are, I don't know what's your take on this, but then talking and building up on that idea of biochemical individuality, there are some people who are better suited to be vegans, or maybe they have like the better genes to be vegans than someone living in a completely different climate, a completely different country, completely different ancestry. So you sort of have to look at that equation as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. It's so complicated as far as each individual is unique, and that's why I don't think there's one diet that's right for everybody. I think
Mhm.
you kind of have to meet people where they are and go from there to help build a plan. But as far as the vegan thing and just diet individuality, um, certainly we did not evolve to not get meat in our diet. Like, without meat, we don't get B12, and without B12, we inevitably die. The reason we have these incisors
Mhm.
is to, that kind of, don't look at my teeth, I need braces. The reason that we have those is because to digest, to break down meat. We evolved to eat meat. Having said that, I don't know about your country, but in America, we eat too much meat.
Mhm.
And so most of the time, most people eating too much and not enough vegetables. So we got to kind of find a compromise. But to your point about what you were saying about some people genetically are just better suited, what's interesting to me about that, I was just writing about that before, because I'm writing a book right now about hemochromatosis and iron overload. And I was just writing about that this morning, how people who are vegans and vegetarians are less likely to have a problem with iron overload because they don't get as much iron in their diet. And there's a gene for that, which a lot of people have. It's called the Celtic curse, because so many people of Northern European descent and Irish descent have it. So I'm sure there's a lot of other examples like that out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. The iron overload is one of the reasons why I would donate blood every 2 months. And in Dubai, it's one of those things that you can only donate blood every 2 months. It's not like I have
Wow, you donate blood every 2 months?
every 2 months just to keep my iron levels in check.
Have you checked your genes to see if you have those iron genes?
I don't, but normally my iron levels, I mean, they're not extremely high, but they're not super low as well. So just a
See?
good recycling of blood, I thought is a good idea, and it sort of gives, I mean, provides a blood pool bank to people. But one of
So
the other things that,
you don't have those genes?
no, I
You
don't
don't?
have those, don't have those snips.
That's amazing that you're able to donate blood that much.
Yeah,
That's impressive.
and the next thing that happens is sometimes I feel vegans or vegetarians are also somewhat at the risk of iron overdose, because most of the vegans, at least when I was vegan, I was heavily reliant on, these vegan cereals. And if you flip the back of any cereal, like, any processed cereal, most of them would have unappreciated appreciable amounts of high iron. And this is one thing that, has struck me after many years. I was like, oh, okay, all these processed foods, like, mostly people would look at the calories and how much potassium or protein it has, but if you look at just the iron content, it's like half a serving is more than what you need in like a week. It's
Yeah,
that crazy.
that's interesting. And why, if it's such a great food, why are they having to add all these nutrients to it? You know, they strip it all out in the processing and then they add things back to make it, more nutritious. So,
So the general consumer just goes and says, oh, okay, perfect, I'm getting iron and potassium and whatever protein.
I mean, I would wager that most people don't even look at those things. I would wager that most people just look at the calories and
Yeah,
maybe the fat and the carbs, and they're just, that's it, they're
yeah.
done. Like, or maybe they just don't look at anything and they're just,
It's just
eating
some people
whatever.
like us who are like looking into the details of everything
Oh
before
yeah,
we sort of have
yeah.
it. But let's move on. Now, you mentioned a few things about these genes that might be harmful, or these genes that might have an advantageous or mostly a disadvantageous point. So let's talk about some of these genes. What are some of the top genes do you think that you would specifically look into when you look at like a big report like the one from
Okay,
2024? Is there something that
yeah.
stands out?
That's a good question. So I mentioned the hemochromatosis iron genes. I always look at those, and I'm always looking at iron lab panels. Let me preface this with, I don't like to look at genes without a really full lab panel, like a very comprehensive lab panel. And the labs that I order might even be influenced by the genes that you have. So I might order additional things that I may not otherwise order if you don't have a specific gene. And so, but in general, I like to have both of those things to kind of build a picture as far as where the priority is. Because I think genes alone are not nearly as valuable and sometimes misguiding as having additional clinical information, and labs are a part of that. Also, just talking to people and talking to them about what their lives are like, what they are doing, what they're not doing. Okay, so I mentioned the hemochromatosis gene. I think the ApoE4, the Alzheimer's gene, is really important as well.
Hmm.
There's definitely strong data showing that increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease, late onset Alzheimer's disease, meaning after age 65. And with all diseases, but especially neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, you can prevent them much more so than you can. There's really not a good cure, right? Like once you have damage to your brain, that's a very difficult situation to get out of. What is much easier and successful is preventing damage. And of course, we know how to do that. It's just more work, and it's a chronic disease process that you have to prevent. It's not as easy as saying, okay, you have this symptom and take this
Take the
pill.
pills. Yeah.
It doesn't work. That's not how you prevent diseases.
And
And
it happens over a
Alzheimer's,
period of time, right? It happens over years or maybe decades.
decades. You know what? I'm glad you said that. So by the time you have had symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. The damage has been going on for decades before that. And I believe that the damage actually often begins as a young child. And the reason I say that is because when you have the Alzheimer's gene and you get a concussion, you don't heal up from that concussion as well. Your blood-brain barrier always becomes leaky after a concussion, regardless of your genotype. But if you have that Alzheimer's gene, then there's empirical evidence that your blood-brain barrier does not heal up as well as it should and could otherwise. And you have this kind of prolonged leaky blood-brain barrier, which creates more inflammation, neuroinflammation, more neurodegeneration. So most children get concussions. By the time you're an adult, you have gotten a concussion. If you haven't, then either you're not aware of it or, you've just lived a very charmed life. I don't think that's a real thing. I think, anybody that's had a child knows, like, they fall. And then if you're in sports, then you're going to have a concussion. And the problem is most people don't realize that they have a concussion, and they don't realize because they're not educated on what that really looks like. They're waiting for somebody to say diagnose them, or they pass out, and that's just not what most concussions look like. But if you've been playing sports that were contact sports, you've had a concussion. So as these people with this Alzheimer's gene are growing up, they get these concussions that are not probably diagnosed and healed up correctly, because the average person and clinician is just not very good at this specific problem and hasn't been good at this specific problem for, proceeding up to this point. They're still not good at it. They've never been good at it. Hopefully we'll get better. So this damage, I believe, starts at a very young age. This is why I think that all children should get genetic testing for certain things at a young age, because personally, I would not be comfortable allowing my daughter to play a contact sport. Like right now, she plays soccer and she's really into it. And I'm aware that soccer is the most common concussion sport for a girl. I'm aware of that. And I know, I'm careful. I pay attention to what happens, the symptoms, everything. Having said that, it's going to happen because this is a contact sport. And so I would not be comfortable with her playing that if she had an Alzheimer's gene. And I look out on the field and I know some of those kids have that gene, and they're going to get a concussion and they're not going to heal up from it as well as they should. And the long-term effects of that, we don't, you just don't understand. Or maybe know or be able to connect back to that event. But I believe that if we're looking at a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's disease, it starts at a very young age, which means that you need to be diagnosed with that gene at a very young age, and you need to start a very personalized, precise healthcare plan at an early age. And that's the approach that I take with my patients. And, I've only been in practice for 10 years, maybe 11. And so I can't tell you if I don't have that long-term 60-year study. But having said that, if you look at the medications that are available right now for these neurodegenerative diseases, none of them are fixing the problem. And they really don't have super long-term studies either, because it's not cost effective. They just want to get it to market as fast as possible, rather than really kind of have that 60-year study.
Sometimes I feel that as a doctor, you have like a different approach to it, but as a consumer or as someone who might have, might someone in my family might have as Alzheimer's, or I wanted to prevent this situation faster. Sometimes I feel like you don't need those 60 years. Yeah, okay, it's always better that you have a long term data, and then you can have some sort of an analysis. But if there are lifestyle interventions, if there are like non-pharmaceutical, like nutraceutical or some other sort of invention, non-invasive, sort of inventions that can come across, then, and if someone has seen it, like let's say for example 10 years is a long time, but like let's say you've seen, you were in practice for 3 or 4 years, and suddenly using some techniques, some of your patients are really getting better, and you have that anecdotal data, then
Yeah,
why not use it for like the others? Because some people won't have 60 years, some people won't even have 10 years, and
right.
this is the classic situation that you take, all these guys have, now having Alzheimer's and dementia and all of these things. So yeah, sometimes it's more like see what works and do it.
Yeah, no, no. That's a good point, and I want to kind of talk about that for a minute because I don't want people to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm 60 or 70, and it's too late for me to do anything
Mhm.
about it because it's never too late. It's just the earlier you get started, the better. Just like it's much better to start saving money when you're young than to wait until you're in your 60s and start saving for your retirement when you're 65.
You
The
get the
sooner you start,
compounding
the better.
effect.
Yeah, the work that you do, just like your savings compounds with time. Well, what you do when you're young compounds with time for the better or the worse, depending on if you're making good or bad decisions. Having said that, absolutely, it is never too late. Somebody coming in their 40s is better than coming in with their 60s with the same genetic, challenge. What I really don't like is somebody coming in like in their 70s and they already have memory problems. Having said that, I have seen improvement in those people, and I believe that there's less degeneration in those people. And we can measure that improvement by doing a Montreal cognitive assessment, which is a objective numerical way to actually measure brain health. And
Mhm.
so every treatment plan is different because everybody's different, but there are specific like nutraceuticals that to your point, I'm just like, let's do it, because you don't have anything to lose at that point in time.
Mhm. True. I'm glad you brought that up. So what else? You've spoken about APO, and correct me if I'm wrong. Does ApoE4 have some role to play in cholesterol metabolism as well?
Yeah,
Does
yeah,
it does?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So with you can inherit, one or two ApoE4s. You can have none. You can have ApoE2, which is protective against Alzheimer's. But most people, most people don't have either. Most people are ApoE3/3, which is that's neutral as far as you're not likely to get Alzheimer's disease. It's not protective, it's just neutral. Now you can inherit one or two ApoE4. If you inherit one, your risk for high cholesterol and Alzheimer's disease is higher than if you had none. If you inherit two, then your risk for high cholesterol and Alzheimer's disease is higher than if you had just inherited one. And not only is the risk higher, but the age of onset is younger. So the average person that inherits two will start seeing symptoms around age 65. And then the average person that inherits one will start seeing symptoms around age 75. And then for those people that do get Alzheimer's disease and don't have either of those genes, they're much older, like in their 80s, and it's just a much smaller segment of the Alzheimer's population. But it's still possible because, maybe they just had the perfect environmental storm that there's other things that can cause Alzheimer's. It's not just that one gene, it's just that one gene is an increased risk. And it does definitely increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, high cholesterol. In fact, when I see somebody that has you know, high cholesterol and it's really kind of challenging to get it down despite diet, nutrition, nutraceutical, precision nutrition, exercise, and especially if they have a family history of any type of memory, dementia type stuff, then I really want to see those Alzheimer's genes, and I want to know like what are we up against? Because if I want people to be very clear that if you have really high cholesterol and you have this genotype, then you're going to have to be much more aggressive with getting, where you want to be. And my hope for people is that they can get their cholesterol to a good level, a normal level, because I don't want my patients, especially if they have a risk for Alzheimer's disease, to be put on a statin, which is a cholesterol lowering drug, because statins, have been shown to be bad for your memory and your brain, and they create certain nutritional deficiencies, and it's just there's a lot of side effects. So I would much rather get somebody's cholesterol lower naturally, and often that involves specific nutrition. It's just sometimes you feel like you got to throw a lot at it.
Okay. What about MTFHR? Do you have a look at the MTFHR?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So MTHFR, it's has to do with metabolizing folate. So folate is vitamin B9, and we eat folate in our diet. It's in green leafy vegetables. And then our body converts it with that MTHFR enzyme. It converts it into methylfolate. And then that methylfolate is what allows the methylation cycle to go around. And the whole point of the methylation cycle is to recycle homocysteine and create SAMe, which SAMe is kind of like an important molecule for turning on and off genes. And so if you have an MTHFR problem, then, at its basic level, what's happening is your MTHFR enzyme is not able to convert folate, the inactive form of vitamin B9, into the active form of vitamin B9. And then you kind of clog up the metabolic pathways that happen after that.
Mhm.
And then there's side effects from clogging up those metabolic pathways. And those can be varied and extensive. If you look in my book on the MTHFR gene, there's a long list of all the potential health effects and problems related to that. And it's very long and extensive because ultimately you clog up those metabolic pathways, and then it just can create all sorts of problems.
Yeah,
So,
this is very important as well, because most of the times when people come up to me and they ask me, hey, I did my genetic testing, what are some of the things that I should be looking at? Most of the people have like, at least the ones that I see, they're more like either too hyper or too, I mean, they're going through some sort of a hard time. They're not being able to cope up with life stress. And then like there are a set of things that I asked them, if they did follow my advice, and I asked them, please go get a genetic testing done. If you've done everything, like let's see what you will be surprised too. And you don't even have to come to me, like read your results yourself and you will be surprised. And MTHFR is one of those things where I tell them that, hey, listen, on the bright side, if it's all good, then it can help you in a lot of DNA repair processes. It can help you be productive. It could help you be alert. But then if you're not being able to methylate properly, and methylation is also one of those processes that if you're looking to live for a longer time, then you better have your methylation processes right. And it could lead from anxiety to depression to heart attack. Like you said, the list is so long. And that's and because it's only a process of like converting the B9 into, or the folic acid to, its methylated form, there's easy fixes to it as well. And you don't have to go through like crazy complicated things. So that's why I keep telling people like, hey, listen, there are some of the genes that it's advisable to look at. One of them would be MTFHR. And also, like, if you have some sort of a deficiency, or if you are looking to optimize it, having some kind of like a methylated B12 or methylfolate, or like you mentioned, SAMe, or even creatine, phosphatidylcholine, all of these things can help. And these things can be easily accessible. And you don't have to go through Sometimes people ask me about peptides and all these things, and I'm like, hey, listen, that's all very complicated. Just keep your life simple and just look at some of these things. So what else do you think? I have few ideas that I can share with you, like some of the things that I personally think are like important genes, but I want to hear from you. Anything else that comes to your mind?
Certainly. I think before we move on from MTHFR, I I personally, clinically, when I see somebody that has MTHFR, I'm always measuring their homocysteine level. I mean, I do that anyways, but especially if they have MTHFR. And I like to get that homocysteine within like a narrow range of around 6 to 8. And I never just give somebody methylfolate. Okay. I might give them like extra methylfolate in addition to homocysteine redox, which is a supplement that I give a lot of people. And full disclosure, like that's from my supplement line. But what that supplement has is it has not just the methylfolate, which you need, but it also has the methylcobalamin and the B6 and the B2 and the TMG and everything to make that pathway work, the methylation cycle work. And one thing that I think is very interesting, and maybe a lot of people are not aware of it, you probably are, is that that enzyme, the MTHFR enzyme, yes, every genetic risk allele you have, yours works less efficiently, but you can also have no genetic risk alleles, have the perfect MTHFR genes, and be low in vitamin B2 and still have an MTHFR enzyme that doesn't work very well, because the B2 attaches to that MTHFR enzyme and it like changes the shape of it so that it works better. So if you're not taking B2 or if you're low in B2, you're going to have more MTHFR issues. So that's why I give that supplement that has everything in it, because and if for some reason I think people need extra folate because maybe they're pregnant or I'm not happy with their homocysteine levels coming down like they should, then I'll give them more, or maybe just methylfolate, which is an option. But it's not like, I think it's erroneous and shows a level of ignorance about MTHFR when somebody is just given the methylfolate in a high dose, because there's a lot of potential problems related to that. So when I have a patient that comes in and they have that, I guess I'm happy they're taking that rather than not taking anything. Somebody has led them down a right path. They just didn't get them all the way there.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I think the work you're doing is so great, because you're, like I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, you're not just using, I mean, you're using your experience, you're using the science, you're using the research, and you're using all of these complex informations together, like the B2 part, even I wasn't aware of it. So you're using all of these other information and then seeing what can be best suited for the client. And this is something that I haven't seen many people do, and that's one of the primary reasons why I wanted to get you onto the show, because there are a lot of people out there who might have some information on how some things work, but to go the extra mile, you have to look into a lot of other data, like you mentioned. So thank you for doing that. And yeah, so we covered MTHFR, ApoE4. What else is left? Some of the
Well, we talked
genes.
about the hemochromatosis iron gene.
Yeah.
Did you want me to talk about another one, or I don't know how?
Anything else you think is important for us to mention? Like
Oh,
if someone
I
did their
think
genetic report, or
we
they
we
want
could
to.
we could talk all day. there's
Okay,
there's
let's
I
go
can
for
keep
one more.
on and on and on. It's just a matter of how.
Yeah, let's go for one more, and then we'll move on
Okay.
from this.
Well, the first one that comes to mind is, and this is, I guess, for personal reasons, is the celiac gene. I think is an important one. Well, there's two celiac genes, but they're both celiac genes, and they both result in the end result of increased risk for autoimmune diseases. specifically increased risk for celiac disease, which is an autoimmune disease that causes your immune system to attack your body when you eat gluten.
Yeah.
And it's misperceived as just being a digestive disease. But the reality is that while many people that have celiac disease have digestive problems when they eat gluten, the a large number of people actually they develop neurological problems and not digestive problems when they eat gluten if they have this gene, because celiac disease triggers an autoimmune process, and it doesn't just stop at your gut for a lot of people. It often goes to other parts of your body. This is why there's, I don't know if you've ever heard of dermatitis herpetiform, but that's a skin condition that results from celiac disease in people eating gluten. And they develop this awful itchy rash because they're eating gluten and they have celiac disease, and maybe they don't even have a digestive problem. Maybe they just have this skin rash.
Mhm.
And so then there's gluten ataxia. Gluten ataxia is when you eat gluten and your immune system is triggered to attack your cerebellum, which a lot of what happens is the gluten has like a molecular mimicry to your cerebellum or other parts of your body, and your body kind of mistakes the gluten for a part of your body, and then it attacks. That autoimmune disease causes your immune system to attack a certain part of your body. So in gluten ataxia, it attacks your cerebellum, and then, well, ataxia means like you have poor balance and gait, and basically you just end up having this kind of weird walk and cerebellar damage, which causes balance problems and a lot of neurological problems that you don't want.
Mhm.
So, and unfortunately, like I was mentioning about neurodegenerative diseases, um, anything that destroys and damages your nervous system, it has long-term implications. So that's why it's really important to diagnose these things early before there is serious neurological damage. So I have this gene. I passed it down to my daughter. I think that, celiac disease, the celiac gene was a part of me developing Crohn's. Um, at a very young age, my daughter developed gluten sensitivity, and I took her off of gluten because I didn't want it to progress to celiac disease. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about as far as that goes. It's a big topic, but it's nice that we can look at the genes to kind of see what your risks are, because if I see that gene in somebody, then I always feel the need to talk to people about it, because maybe it's not affecting them, or maybe it is and they're just not aware of it,
Mhm.
but maybe it's affecting like one of their relatives, maybe their children, maybe their parents. So not everybody is affected the same, but when you can talk to people about these things, then there's a lot of value, not just in helping that person, but you kind of get to help a lot of different people within their family if they kind of let you.
Mhm. Yeah, the awareness part of it is a big thing. And personally, for me, I keep on telling people that people who don't even have celiac disease, but gluten and some of the proteins associated with like ghaladen and things, they enter the body. And even if you don't have some sort of a biomarker for like a celiac disease, but they sort of, they have a protein called zonulin. They start poking up holes in your gut. A lot others call it leaky gut. So these tight barriers in your gut, they start getting open, and then a lot of the unwanted things might flow out in the bloodstream. Then we have, an onset of other inflammatory pathways that are activated. There's lipopolysaccharides. If the toxins are crazy enough, they can eventually leak into your blood-brain barrier and be transported into the brain, where this causes another set of neurological issues. But then for everyone who's super focused on performance, longevity, generally, I mean, if you have it all the time, like there is some level of low grade inflammation that keeps on coming with gluten. And sometimes you're right, you don't even realize it. You realize it after like 4 or 5 days, and then you get brain fog, you get slow, you can't focus at work or at the gym. So I'm glad you brought that up. Now, since now we've covered about genes and what genes are, proteins, we've covered about so many genetic factors. What Let's look at some solutions. So I know we okay, I know we everyone who's listening would be like, okay, you said there's not a one size fits all. But if we had to give away like general strategies for not flipping that switch on, right, what are some of the basic strategies that you think are important for everyone who's listening to, and some things that are easy that they can employ in their own life?
Yeah, so some of those things we already discussed. General strategies, if we just kind of get as big and general as possible. I mean, look at the main things that are creating problems. Clean up your diet, reduce sugar intake, increase vegetables, healthy proteins, fruits, nuts. I'm not a big fan of gluten, grains in general, so I like people to eat kind of a low inflammatory diet, period. That's huge. Gut microbiome, making sure that your gut flora is healthy through probiotics and minimizing antibiotics. Reducing stress, that's a huge piece of the puzzle and often something that is hard to kind of quantify and acknowledge, but that's huge. And having tools for that as both just a general person and as a clinician, like that's a really important thing as far as my practice. Um, Exercise, of course, we're just talking about ways to turn on good genes and turn off bad genes. Exercise in a way that is healthy for you. Don't exercise in a way that's going to stress out your body more. And sleep. Make sure that you're getting adequate quality sleep. And spending time with, having a good support system, family unit, whatever, friends, whatever, just to kind of help people with that mental health piece.
Mm-hmm.
Those are probably the most generic. I use a lot of nutrition in my practice, and there's specific supplements that I could go into if you want.
Yeah, go for it. You
Yeah,
have you.
so as far as like a lot of times people will say like, if there were just like 3 or 4 things that you would recommend just generally to everybody, like what would that be? And that's a hard question for me to answer because I'm thinking, well, what are your genes? What are your labs? What are your risk factors? And it's hard to narrow that down to 3 or 4 because the reality is that most people have more problems than they are aware of or want to acknowledge and address. So, but if I've thought about this a lot, and in general, the top ones are I'm gonna bore you with these answers because it's so obvious. Like
Go for it.
vitamin D, just because most people are low in vitamin D and there are some genes that, make that exacerbated, but vitamin D is a big one. And that's just something that I consider kind of like a low hanging fruit that you get to fix so many things with one pill. People don't put up a big stink about taking it. Maybe they don't feel dramatically better taking it, but it's very important. Usually some type of omegas, fish oil type of thing, just for general inflammation and brain health. Probiotic, and then maybe a good multivitamin mineral.
Mm-hmm.
And I just always feel like when I stop there, I feel like that's better than nothing, but like I'm just disappointed that that's it. because, and for a lot of people, if they can just do those things and maybe that's all they can do, that's better than nothing. But ideally, I mean, I just think people need more than that. And what they need depends on their specific situation, usually.
I think that's the spot on. While you were giving your take on this, I was mentally thinking, if I someone put me on the spot and they asked me like what were the four supplements that I would recommend to someone, our list matched pretty much. I would say the first thing would be vitamin D, but combined with some sort of a bioavailable K2
Yeah,
formula.
I only give D3K2. Thank you for
That
that.
that
Yeah.
would be one. The second would be yeah, a fish oil. Well, something with high EPA, DHA. That's good for brain health, oral inflammation, just good for your cell integrity as well. Then I would add some sort of like a complete mineral spectrum. I prefer like having like a full spectrum mineral with some like high something. I would technically add more magnesium, but if someone can find a full spectrum mineral with like high levels of magnesium, that would be one. And the fourth for me would be amino acids, just not branch chain amino acids, but just pure amino acids, which they could again do so many things in our body. So I'm happy our list like match like 80%. So
Yeah,
that's good.
yeah, yeah. I
So
think those are all great.
yeah, so you mentioned about like getting DNA tests at an early age. Is there any disadvantages, do you think, that people might have of getting a DNA test?
Well, yes. But I think that has more to do with the lack of knowledge and understanding with what to do with the data than the actual risk. So I I think it's important. That's part of why I kind of wrote the book, was to give people tools for if they've done this genetic testing and want to know more about what their genes mean. And it's not perfect, I would love to have the time to go back and redo it. But yes, that would be the main risk, just creating an unintended anxiety or stress or fear.
Mhm,
And so that's why I think, it's important to have somebody that can kind of talk you through it and give you tools to latch onto rather than just theoretical fears.
mhm.
But it's important to be aware, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want people to have serious genetic risks and I didn't kind of address them in a meaningful, productive way. I don't, want people to put their head down in the sand. It's just some people I don't think are always in the right headspace for that.
Mhm. I think personally is always a good idea to have your genes tested, and even like to your point, doing it at an early age, like if you have a child and if you do it for your child, it just saves you so much of decision making and hassle of navigating through your child's life, because now you sort of have like a plan. And again, you might be able to do it yourself, but I highly recommend that you get in touch with someone like Dr. Christy who can guide you through this. And like just as an example, growing up in the Middle East, I was fond of health, but I would also engage in the tradition and smoke a lot of like this tobacco water pipe called shisha or hookah for a very long time. And then everyone would tell me, "Oh, it's not that healthy." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know, but whatever. I'm young, I can do it." And until unless like so many years ago when I got my genes tested and I found that I am not able to detoxify correctly. So my GST-GPX gene, there was a deletion in one of those things. So basically what I'm trying to say for everyone is that me compared to someone else who might be smoking shisha, I'm at a disadvantage because my body doesn't detox a lot of these chemicals, a lot of these, not tobacco, but like all of these tar and all these different chemicals that are inside. So it might be very easy for a friend who's sitting next to me, and that's why they probably don't feel anything. But then for me, it makes a hell lot of a difference, and it is one thing that will not let me live for a long time. So what did I do? I used that information. I stopped smoking. I don't even go near to smoke. And now every time I'm put into situations where I know that my detox pathways might take a strain, I either supplement or I stay away from the situation. So it could be as easy as this, like understanding what your genes are saying, predicting it with like the help of an expert, and then taking simple steps, just like saying no to some things, and that could take you a long way. And I mean, me and Dr. Chrissy can be talking for ages, and we might do a second episode on all these genes. And if someone's interested, let us know, and we'll probably make time somewhere in the future. But now we're coming to the end of the podcast, and my question to you is, if you had a time machine, like let's say you could go back in time, and then you could go to your younger self, right, at 20 years old or whatever, and you could give yourself one piece of advice, knowing all that you know right now. This doesn't have to be on doing a genetic testing, it could be on anything. What would be that one piece of advice that you would go back and tell your younger self?
Oh, well, for me, 20 wasn't young enough. I would have to go back much further because by the time I was 20, I'd already had serious health problems that I would have liked to avoid before that. Not that 20 was too late, but when I was 16, I had part of my small intestine removed and was diagnosed with Crohn's. When in reality, the problem really started many years before that. It just came to a head when I was 16. So I would really like to go back to like 10-year-old me.
Mhm.
Specifically, I think at that point in time, I'd like to go back to like my parents as a 10-year-old because they really have more control. And um, at that point in time, it's more about what your parents are telling you to do and not to do than you as a 10-year-old. So, I mean, I would like to go back to 10-year-old me and my parents and say, get this child off of gluten and get her some good vitamins and heal up her gut and stop giving her antibiotics when they're just destroying her health. So that would be me going back to 10-year-old me. If I was to go back to 20-year-old me, I would probably say you might need a bile sequestrant because your part of your small intestine that was removed is not, because I had part of my small intestine removed, I was not able to absorb bile, and that bile was creating like a laxative effect. And that took way too long to get diagnosed, and I almost kind of like most of my things have to self diagnose it. Um, but yeah, that's kind of an idiosyncrasy for me.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for telling us about your life, and telling some of these parts which not a lot of people are comfortable sharing. So I appreciate you for that. And for anyone who's listening, how can they get in touch with you? Let's say someone listening to this show says, I'm going to do my 23andMe or something else. How do they get in touch with you? What's the best URL or website?
Well, they can go to genetic detoxification, and from there, there's a Dr. Sutton link that will link you to my practice information. Um, so you can also, I think, just Google Dr. Christy Sutton, and I'll probably come up. You can look up, you can Google my book, genetic detoxification, or sorry, genetic testing, defining your path to a personalized health plan. Christy Sutton, and you'll find me. But genetic detoxification is the best direct
Okay.
way to kind of get to me.
We will put that in the show notes. And Dr. Chrissy, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time, presence, and energy with me. You've,
Thank
I'm
you.
sure the conversation that we've had has blown a lot of people's minds. And I'm grateful for all the good work that you've been doing, all the healing that you've brought to yourself, your family, and to others over the past so many years. I appreciate you for that. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for everything that you do.
Thank you so much. And this is me, everyone, CJ, talking to you from the Ship with CJ podcast. Everyone, have a great day ahead of you.